Hey, big guy, I bet you can't last 30 seconds sparring with us. What do you say?
Alexis Sterling had said at 10:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening as she stood in the main training area of Sterling Martial Arts Center watching Isaiah Mitchell finish mopping floors after final class had ended, her tone carrying mixture of boredom and casual cruelty that characterized successful people who'd spent so long at top of their field that they'd forgotten how to interact with service workers without condescension, making her challenge to Building's night janitor seem like entertainment rather than genuine invitation to demonstrate skill. At 35, Alexis Sterling possessed the kind of aggressive confidence that characterized martial artists whose third-degree black belt and 15 years of competitive karate had created belief that physical dominance was measure of human worth. And seeing large black man pushing cleaning cart through gym she co-owned with her twin sister Madison triggered impulse to assert superiority through combat challenge that would demonstrate martial arts expertise while humiliating service worker who existed in building primarily to maintain cleanliness that paying members expected. Unless mopping floors is your only skill, Madison added from beside her sister, the twins' synchronized cruelty revealing pattern where they reinforced each other's worst impulses through competitive dynamic that made them formidable business partners but occasionally terrible human beings whose success had insulated them from consequences of treating people beneath their social position as objects for amusement rather than as humans deserving basic respect. At 38, Isaiah "Zay" Mitchell possessed the kind of careful stillness that characterized combat veterans whose military service had taught them that real violence wasn't entertainment, and that physical dominance over untrained civilians proved nothing except that training mattered, making twin CEOs' challenge to Janitor feel less like genuine test of skill and more like rich women amusing themselves by humiliating working man whose actual combat expertise they couldn't recognize. Because his custodial uniform prevented them from seeing former Marine Corps martial arts program instructor whose 15 years of military service had included training special forces operators in hand-to-hand combat that made sport karate seem like children's game. "I don't think that's a good idea, Mom," Isaiah replied, using respectful address while continuing to mop floors that twins' evening training session had dirtied with sweat and footprints, his refusal motivated not by fear but by recognition that sparring with business owners who employed him would end badly regardless of outcome. If he lost, they'd mock him further. If he won, they'd likely fire him for embarrassing them, and neither option was worth risking job that provided health insurance. For his 9-year-old daughter Amara, whose asthma medication cost $400 monthly without coverage. "Ma'am?" Alexis repeated mockingly, exchanging glance with Madison that communicated shared amusement about Janitor's deference. "Oh, he's scared. 30 seconds, big guy. Or are you too busy with your mop to show us what you've got?" The provocation was deliberately designed to make refusal seem cowardly rather than professional, creating a situation where Isaiah's choices were limited to accepting humiliating challenge or accepting different humiliation of being mocked as coward by women who interpreted his reluctance as weakness rather than as restraint, born from understanding that real combat wasn't game and that demonstrating his actual capabilities would reveal military background he'd been deliberately concealing for 7 years since leaving service. For 43 seconds, Isaiah considered options, while twins waited expectantly for response they assumed would be either fearful refusal or incompetent acceptance that would give them entertainment at expense of service worker whose dignity they'd already decided was less important than their boredom and competitive need to assert dominance over man, whose size made him threatening target for demonstration of martial arts superiority. "All right," Isaiah finally said, setting mop aside with deliberate care, "but you asked for this." The warning was both fair and inadequate. Fair because he was genuinely alerting them that sparring would not go as they anticipated. Inadequate because nothing he could say would prepare them for discovering that Janitor they'd been mocking was former military instructor whose combat training made their sport karate seem like elaborate dance rather than functional fighting system. "Oh, this is going to be good," Madison said to Alexis as they moved to center mat, their confidence absolute, because neither had ever faced opponent whose training transcended sport context into actual combat application, where goal wasn't scoring points, but rather neutralizing threats as efficiently as possible, using techniques that tournament rules forbade, but which battlefield necessity required. 30 seconds, Alexis confirmed, activating timer on wall clock that would document how long Janitor lasted against 2 third-degree black belts, whose competitive records included multiple state championships and whose training regimen involved sparring 4 times weekly against skilled opponents from their own dojo. Standard light contact sparring rules. First clean hit to head or body scores point. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly. Isaiah stepped onto mat still wearing custodial uniform, navy blue work pants and grey shirt with sterling martial arts, maintenance staff embroidered on pocket, while twins assumed fighting stances that 15 years of karate had made automatic, their positioning revealing expectation that he would charge forward aggressively like untrained person might, giving them easy opportunity to demonstrate superior technique through counterstrikes that his lack of defensive skill would make. Inevitable, what happened in next 17 seconds would become legendary story, retold throughout martial arts community in following months, discussed in Reddit threads and YouTube analysis videos that tried to break down exactly how Night Janitor had systematically dismantled 2 black belt CEOs so completely that witnesses initially thought they were watching choreographed demonstration rather than actual sparring match. The timer started. Alexis attacked first, snap kick toward Isaiah's midsection that was textbook karate technique, fast and precise, and exactly the kind of opening strike that had worked in hundreds of previous sparring matches against opponents whose training had prepared them to recognize and counter sport-based attacks. Isaiah's response wasn't sport-based. It was Marine Corps martial arts program technique that treated kick not as point-scoring opportunity, but as limb to be controlled, redirected, and used to unbalance attacker whose commitment to strike created vulnerability that sports context typically prevented from being exploited because tournament rules forbade techniques Isaiah employed automatically. He caught Alexis's kick mid-extension, redirected her momentum using leverage that sport karate didn't teach, swept her supporting leg, and controlled her descent to mat using grip that prevented injury while demonstrating complete technical superiority that made 15 years of her training seem inadequate preparation for combat with opponent whose expertise came from context where losing meant dying rather than losing points. 7 seconds had elapsed. Madison attacked while her sister was falling, rushing forward with combination punches that represented aggressive response to witnessing Alexis being dominated. Her strikes fast and technically sound, but telegraphed in ways that combat veteran could read, because sport training created patterns that battlefield experience learned to exploit. Isaiah deflected her first punch using forearm check that military combatives taught, slipped inside her second punch using footwork that closed distance faster than karate training anticipated, executed standing arm triangle choke that martial arts didn't include in standard curriculum, and controlled Madison's descent as consciousness faded within 4 seconds of applying properly positioned carotid restriction that combat training made automatic. 14 seconds total had elapsed. Both Sterling twins were on mat, Alexis controlled through positional dominance that prevented her from rising, Madison unconscious from briefly applied choke that had been released the moment her body went limp, while Isaiah stood calmly between them, breathing normally, having expended minimal energy, dominating two black belt martial artists whose sport training had been completely inadequate preparation for combat veteran, whose expertise came from 15 years of teaching military operators how to kill efficiently using techniques that transcended tournament point scoring into actual violence that Isaiah had carefully controlled to demonstrate superiority without causing injury beyond twins' bruised egos and shocked recognition that they'd completely misjudged Janitor they'd been mocking. The gym was silent, except for Madison's gasping as consciousness returned, and she processed that she'd been choked unconscious by man she'd been calling Janitor 17 seconds ago, and Alexis's frustrated breathing as she recognized that positional control preventing her from rising wasn't result of lucky technique, but rather systematic application of superior grappling that her karate training had never adequately addressed. 17 seconds, Isaiah said quietly, helping Madison sit up to ensure she recovered properly from choke, then offering hand to help Alexis stand from position she couldn't escape without his assistance. I told you this wasn't good idea. Some discoveries about expertise hidden beneath humble employment emerge when arrogant people mistake service workers for easy targets. And sometimes the most devastating lessons about humility come from 30-second sparring sessions that reveal 15 years of martial arts training can be completely dominated by combat veteran whose actual expertise was invisible until provoked into demonstration that leaves witnesses questioning everything they believed about correlation between social position and actual capability. Before we continue with what happened after those 17 seconds, I need you to do something. If you felt that moment when Isaiah caught Alexis's kick and everything changed, if you understood why he tried to refuse, if you've ever been underestimated because of your job or appearance, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button if those 17 seconds gave you chills. Comment below, what time is it? Where are you watching from? Have you ever been underestimated and then proved everyone wrong? Have you ever witnessed someone with hidden skills? Would you have accepted that challenge if you were Isaiah? Because in part 2 we're going to learn why Isaiah works as a janitor when he has elite military training. We're going to meet his 9-year-old daughter, Amara, who doesn't know her dad is a combat legend. And we're going to see what happens when the Sterling twins demand to know who this janitor really is. 2 arrogant CEOs, 1 humble veteran, 17 seconds that changed everything. Don't go anywhere. Part 2 starts right now. The morning after Isaiah Mitchell had dominated both Sterling twins in 17 seconds, he arrived at his apartment at 6:47 a.m. after overnight custodial shift to find his 9-year-old daughter Amara already awake and struggling with her inhaler, the 3rd asthma attack this week, triggered by seasonal allergies that made spring months particularly difficult and reminded Isaiah why maintaining job with health insurance mattered more than pride or recognition of his actual capabilities that last night's sparring had inadvertently revealed to employers who'd been treating him as invisible service worker. "Daddy, I can't breathe right," Amara said between labored breaths, her small hands gripping inhaler that $400 monthly medication made functional, creating immediate focus that pushed last night's confrontation with Sterling twins into background noise compared to daughter's medical crisis that required calm parental response, despite exhaustion from 8-hour shift cleaning gym where he'd humiliated his employers. At 38, Isaiah possessed the kind of automatic calm that combat experience created, his ability to manage crisis situations, making him effective single parent, despite challenges of raising daughter alone after his wife Michelle had died during childbirth complications 7 years ago when delivering their second child, who also hadn't survived, creating trauma that had motivated his departure from military service because remaining in Marines while grieving dead wife and raising infant. Daughter alone had seemed impossible when both responsibilities demanded complete attention. He couldn't divide. Slow breaths, Amara. Just like we practiced, Isaiah coached, sitting beside his daughter and timing her breathing, using techniques that manage panic as much as actual asthma. His focus entirely on her respiratory distress, rather than on fact that his phone had 17 missed calls from Sterling Martial Arts Center and 12 text messages from Alexis and Madison demanding explanation about who he actually was and why he'd been hiding combat expertise while working as their janitor. The medication eventually worked. Amara's breathing normalizing after 8 minutes that felt like hours, leaving both of them exhausted on their worn couch in an apartment that Isaiah's custodial salary could barely afford, but which provided stability that frequent military relocations had never allowed during his 15 years of service. "You okay now, baby girl?" Isaiah asked once Amara's breathing had returned to normal, his hand on her back providing physical reassurance that his presence could be relied upon even when her body couldn't reliably perform basic functions like breathing without pharmaceutical intervention. "I'm okay, Daddy," Amara confirmed, her voice still weak but no longer panicked. "Are you going to sleep now? You look really tired." "In a minute," Isaiah replied, recognizing that he needed to address missed calls and messages from Sterling twins before attempting sleep, because ignoring employers' demands for explanation about last night would likely result in termination that would eliminate health insurance that Amara's survival depended on monthly. Meanwhile, across town in Sterling twins' luxury penthouse apartment, Alexis and Madison were experiencing their own morning crisis as they processed humiliation of being dominated by Janitor in front of 3 gym members who'd been finishing late training and who'd witnessed entire 17-second destruction of twins' martial arts credibility, creating viral moment that 2 witnesses had filmed and posted to social media, where it was currently accumulating views and comments that mocked Sterling twins' arrogance while celebrating mystery Janitor, whose combat skills had revealed their black belts as participation trophies rather than actual fighting capability. The video has 47,000 views, Madison reported at 7:23 a.m., staring at her phone where footage showed her being choked unconscious by man in custodial uniform while her sister was simultaneously controlled on mat, the visual evidence of their complete dominance by service worker. They'd been mocking, creating reputational crisis that threatened martial arts business built on image of twins as elite fighters. Comments are brutal. Black belts beaten by Janitor in 17 seconds, when sport karate meets real combat. These CEOs learned humility the hard way. Our credibility is destroyed. "We need to know who he actually is," Alexis replied, her competitive nature transforming humiliation into obsessive need to understand how they'd been so completely outclassed. Military background doesn't explain that level of technical superiority. "He didn't just beat us. He systematically dismantled everything we tried, using techniques I've never encountered in 15 years of training. That wasn't basic military hand-to-hand. That was elite-level combat expertise." Disdiln, at 35, both Sterling twins possessed the kind of driven intensity that had built billion-dollar fitness empire. But that same competitive drive made last night's defeat feel like existential crisis rather than simple loss, because their entire business model depended on perception that they were martial arts experts whose gym produced elite fighters, and video evidence of them being dominated by Janitor undermined every marketing claim they'd ever made about their fighting capability. "He's not answering calls or texts," Alexis continued, checking her phone where 17 unanswered calls to Isaiah's number suggested he was either sleeping after overnight shift or deliberately avoiding confrontation with employers whose provocation he'd answered with demonstration they clearly hadn't anticipated. We need to talk to him before he comes to work tonight, figure out who he is, why he's working as janitor, and whether we can salvage this situation before our gym loses members who now question whether black belts here mean anything. Mahdi, as Sterling twins planned how to confront Isaiah about his background while managing reputational crisis that viral video had created, Isaiah was reading their messages and recognizing that maintaining employment would require conversation he'd been avoiding for 7 years since leaving military. Explanation about why Marine Corps Martial Arts Program Chief Instructor was mopping floors instead of teaching combat to new Marines or working as high-paid private security contractor. Ms. Sterling, I apologize for not responding earlier. I had family emergency this morning with my daughter. Isaiah texted to Alexis at 8:47 a.m., his careful professional tone attempting to maintain employee-employer boundary that last night's sparring had complicated. I'm available to discuss last night's incident if you need clarification about what happened. Clarification? Alexis's response came within 30 seconds. You dominated 2 black belts in 17 seconds, and there's viral video making us look like amateurs. We need to know who you actually are and why you've been hiding combat expertise while working as our janitor. Come to office at 2 p.m. before your shift starts. This conversation can't wait. Udesh. The message was phrased as request, but felt like command, creating situation where Isaiah had to choose between maintaining privacy about military background that he'd deliberately concealed or providing explanation that would satisfy employers whose humiliation had made them desperate to understand how they'd been so completely outclassed by service worker they'd been underestimating. I'll be there at 2 p.m., Isaiah confirmed, recognizing that conversation was unavoidable and that attempting to maintain fiction that he was just janitor who'd gotten lucky would insult Sterling twins' intelligence while failing to address legitimate questions about why someone with his capabilities was working minimum wage custodial job. As 2 p.m. approached, Isaiah arranged emergency childcare for Amara with their neighbor Mrs. Patterson, explaining that he had unexpected meeting with employers that couldn't be rescheduled, and drove to Sterling Martial Arts Center, preparing for conversation he'd been avoiding since Michelle's death had forced him to make impossible choice between military career that had defined his adult identity and single parenthood that his daughter's survival required when no other family existed to share caregiving responsibilities. "Come in," Alexis said when Isaiah knocked on office door at 1:57 p.m., her tone professional but carrying edge that suggested this wasn't friendly conversation, but rather interrogation about deception that twins felt they'd been victim of. "Sit down. We have questions." Madison sat beside her sister behind large desk that created physical barrier, emphasizing power dynamic between employers and employee, their positioning deliberately designed to make Isaiah feel subordinate, despite previous night having proven that hierarchical authority didn't correlate with actual capability in contexts where physical dominance mattered. "Who are you actually?" Alexis asked without preamble, her directness cutting through any possibility of polite small talk. "And don't say janitor. We know that's not your real identity. That level of combat expertise doesn't come from basic military training. So tell us the truth. Who are you, and why are you mopping our floors?" Some moral choices require deciding whether maintaining privacy about painful past matters more than satisfying legitimate curiosity of people who feel deceived by discovering that humble employee possesses expertise that transforms their understanding of everything they believed about correlation between social position and actual capability. "I'm former Marine Corps Martial Arts Program Chief Instructor," Isaiah said at 2:03 p.m. in Sterling twins' office, his confession emerging after 17 seconds of silence where he'd processed that maintaining privacy about military background was no longer option, after viral video had made his combat expertise public knowledge that explanation couldn't avoid. I served 15 years, trained Special Forces operators in hand-to-hand combat, held MC-MAP Black Belt instructor certification, and left service 7 years ago when my wife died during childbirth and I became single parent to infant daughter whose medical needs required stable civilian employment with health insurance that military relocation schedule couldn't accommodate. At 38, Isaiah possessed careful control over emotion that discussing Michelle's death still triggered. His ability to deliver factual summary without breaking down representing 7 years of therapy and grief processing that had transformed devastating loss into manageable pain that resurfaced during conversations like this, where explaining his current circumstances required acknowledging everything he'd sacrificed when choosing single parenthood over military career that had been his entire adult identity. You're telling us that chief instructor, someone who trained special forces, has been cleaning our gym for 9 months because you need health insurance for your daughter? Madison asked, processing information that recontextualized every interaction they'd had with quiet Janitor, who'd maintained professional distance that they'd interpreted as appropriate deference rather than as deliberate concealment of expertise that rendered their own black belts inadequate. My daughter Amara has severe asthma that requires $400 monthly medication, regular specialist visits, and emergency room access that insurance covers, Isaiah explained, his focus on daughter's medical needs revealing that professional sacrifice wasn't about lack of ambition, but rather about parental responsibility that trumped ego or career advancement when those competing priorities conflicted. Your company offers health insurance to full-time employees, including custodial staff, pays $18 per hour, which covers our rent and basic expenses, and provides overnight shift that allows me to care for Amara during day when schools and daycare operate. That combination of benefits matters more than utilizing my actual expertise in jobs that would pay better but wouldn't provide schedule flexibility that single parent needs. The explanation was both heartbreaking and pragmatic, revealing that Isaiah's custodial work represented carefully calculated choice rather than failure to achieve something better, making Sterling twins' previous condescension seem even more problematic when reframed as mockery of father who deliberately accepted humble employment to prioritize daughter's survival. "Why didn't you tell us about your background when you applied?" Alexis asked, her question carrying edge that suggested she felt deceived by Isaiah's failure to disclose expertise during hiring process. "We could have offered you position as instructor, paid you substantially more, given you responsibilities that matched your actual capabilities. Because I didn't want instructor position," Isaiah replied simply. "Teaching combat brings back trauma from military service that I'm still processing through therapy. Interacting with students requires emotional availability that single parenting exhausts, and instructor schedules conflict with Amara's school hours in ways that overnight custodial work doesn't. I applied for janitor position specifically because it met my needs while avoiding responsibilities that my actual training would make natural, but which my personal circumstances make impossible. As Isaiah explained how professional expertise could become burden rather than asset when personal trauma and parenting responsibilities made utilizing that expertise psychologically or logistically impossible, Sterling twins processed that their assumption about correlation between capability and position had been completely wrong. Isaiah wasn't working beneath his potential because he couldn't do better, but rather because doing better would require sacrifices to his daughter's welfare and his own mental health that success wasn't worth making. "The viral video has 340,000 views now," Madison said, showing her phone where footage of 17-second domination continued spreading across martial arts social media. "Comments are calling you mystery badass janitor, and people are trying to identify you. Your anonymity probably won't last much longer, which means media attention is likely coming. How do you want to handle that? I want to ignore it and hope attention fades before anyone identifies me or Amara, Isaiah replied. His immediate response revealing that public recognition represented threat rather than opportunity, because media interest in his story would disrupt privacy that protected his daughter from scrutiny. That military background and Michelle's death would inevitably attract if his identity became widely known. That's probably not a realistic option, Alexis said. Video has your face, several gym members know your name, and martial arts community is actively trying to identify you through military databases and instructor certifications. Within a week, someone will connect Isaiah Mitchell to Marine Corps service records, and then full story will become public, regardless of whether you cooperate with media interest. Meanwhile, across town at Amara's elementary school, 9-year-old was experiencing her own crisis as classmates had discovered viral video and were showing it to her during recess, creating situation where Amara learned about her father's hidden expertise through social media rather than through direct conversation, fundamentally changing her understanding of parent she'd known as gentle custodian, who worked nights and managed her asthma attacks with patient competence that she'd never connected to combat training until watching him dominate 2 black belts with techniques that looked nothing like gentle father she knew from daily life. Amara, is this really your dad? Her friend Sophie asked during recess at 2:47 p.m., showing phone where video played on repeat. Everyone's saying he's secretly like Jason Bourne or something, that he was Special Forces instructor. Is that true? I don't know, Amara replied honestly, processing that video showed version of her father she'd never witnessed, not the tired man who helped with homework and measured her medication and drove her to doctor appointments, but rather dangerous person who could neutralize 2 trained fighters, simultaneously using violence that seemed incompatible with patient-parent who read her bedtime stories and made her favorite pancakes and never raised his voice, even when she misbehaved. The discovery was both exciting and frightening for 9-year-old, whose understanding of her father had been based on his caregiving role rather than on military background he'd apparently been deliberately concealing, creating questions about why he'd hidden such significant part of his identity and whether parent she knew was complete person or carefully curated version designed to protect her from knowing that daddy who tucked her in at night had expertise in efficiently hurting people. When Isaiah picked Amara up from school at 3:15 p.m., 3 hours before his custodial shift would normally start, schedule disrupted by Sterling twins meeting, his daughter's first question revealed that viral video had already reached her peer group in ways that his careful privacy couldn't prevent. "Daddy, kids at school showed me video of you fighting 2 ladies," Amara said as soon as she got in car, her voice carrying confusion rather than judgment. "They said you were Special Forces and that you know how to hurt people really badly. Is that true? Have you been lying about what you used to do?" Some sacrifices require parents explaining that hidden expertise exists for protective reasons rather than deceptive ones, and that choosing humble employment over utilizing dangerous skills represents love rather than failure. When that choice prioritizes children's stability over parents' ego or career advancement, that trauma makes psychologically costly regardless of financial benefits. 8 days after viral video had accumulated 3 million views and mainstream media had identified Isaiah Mitchell as mysterious janitor, who turned out to be former Marine Corps elite combat instructor, he found himself forming unexpected alliance with Sterling twins based not on romance, though attraction was developing beneath their professional collaboration, but on shared recognition that viral moment had created opportunity to challenge martial arts industry's emphasis on belt ranks and tournament performance over practical self-defense. Skills that Isaiah's combat expertise represented, but which sport karate typically dismissed as too aggressive for civilized practice. We've had 47 membership cancellations this week, Madison reported during meeting at Sterling Martial Arts Center office, where twins had invited Isaiah to discuss business implications of viral video that had simultaneously damaged their credibility while creating massive interest in real combat training that members were demanding. People are saying our black belts are worthless if we got dominated by Janitor in 17 seconds, and they're asking why we don't teach the techniques you used against us. At 35, Madison possessed emerging humility that characterized people whose public humiliation had forced reconsideration of assumptions about their own expertise, and 8 days of reading social media comments mocking her unconsciousness while praising Isaiah's technical superiority had apparently created recognition that sport karate training had significant gaps when evaluated against combat effectiveness rather than tournament point scoring. But we've also had 214 new membership inquiries specifically asking about military combat training and whether we offer instruction from the janitor from the video, Alexis added, presenting business opportunity that viral disaster had created. There's massive demand for what you know, Isaiah, and we're losing current members while missing potential new members because we can't offer training that people are now demanding after seeing what real combat looks like compared to sport karate. You want me to teach combat classes? Isaiah asked, processing proposal that would require utilizing expertise he'd deliberately been avoiding since leaving military because teaching violence triggered PTSD symptoms that therapy was still addressing 7 years after separation from service, that his trauma made difficult to remember without psychological distress. We want to partner with you on creating combat training program that addresses gaps in sport martial arts while building business model that benefits all of us, Madison clarified, presenting framework that positioned Isaiah as equal collaborator rather than as subordinate employee. You design curriculum based on your military experience. We provide facilities and handle business operations. Revenue gets split equitably, and we market this as evolution of Sterling martial arts from sport-focused to combat-effective training. The proposal was both generous and strategic. Generous because it offered Isaiah partnership stake in business where he'd been cleaning floors 9 days ago. Strategic because twins recognized that their reputational recovery required associating themselves with Isaiah's expertise, rather than continuing to be defined by their humiliation at his hands. Teaching combat requires managing my PTSD triggers, arranging childcare for Amara during class hours, and accepting public role that media attention has already made uncomfortable, Isaiah replied, listing obstacles that partnership would require navigating. I left military partially because training violence was psychologically costly in ways that my therapist warned could become unmanageable if I didn't find non-combat career. Your proposal asks me to return to exactly what I left, just in civilian context. What if we structured program so you're not sole instructor, Alexis proposed, adapting partnership model to address Isaiah's concerns. You design curriculum and provide oversight, but we hire additional instructors who handle day-to-day teaching while you consult and demonstrate techniques without bearing full teaching load. That reduces your direct trauma exposure while still utilizing your expertise. As negotiation continued over following weeks, Isaiah found himself drawn into collaboration that required more vulnerability than simple employment had demanded. Explaining his PTSD symptoms so twins could understand scheduling limitations, introducing them to Amara so they could accommodate his parenting responsibilities, sharing details about Michelle's death and his military service that context required, but which personal privacy would have preferred keeping concealed. Tell us about your wife, Madison said during dinner meeting that had evolved from business discussion into something more personal. her question both intrusive and oddly appropriate, given that partnership they were forming required understanding each other's lives beyond just professional capabilities. You've mentioned she died during childbirth, but we don't know anything about who she was or how her death affected your decision to leave military. No, Michelle was civilian contractor I met during deployment in 2009, Isaiah replied, his willingness to discuss painful history representing trust that collaboration had built. She worked logistics support. We married in 2010, and she got pregnant in 2014, shortly before my next deployment. Labor started premature at 7 months while I was overseas. Complications developed, and both she and our son died before I could get emergency leave to return home. Amara was 3 months old. I was in combat zone processing that my wife and son were dead, and I realized that remaining in military while raising infant daughter alone would require compartmentalization that my grief couldn't sustain. The confession was rawer than Isaiah typically allowed, his emotional disclosure revealing depth of trauma that 7 years hadn't fully healed, and which explained why teaching combat felt dangerous when violence was associated with everything he'd lost through military service that had taken him away from wife during her fatal labor. "I'm sorry," Alexis said quietly, her condolences simple but genuine. "Losing your wife and son while deployed, that's incomprehensible grief. And then raising Amara alone while processing that trauma, I don't know how you managed." "I managed by becoming different person than who I'd been in military," Isaiah replied, explaining transformation that Michelle's death had forced. Marine Corps instructor was aggressive, comfortable with violence, defined by combat expertise that made me valuable to service, but which Amara didn't need from father. I had to become gentle parent, who could read bedtime stories without having flashbacks to combat, who could manage asthma attacks without triggering hypervigilance that military training had created, who could prioritize daughter's stability over utilizing expertise that made me employable in dangerous contexts that single parents shouldn't choose. As Isaiah explained how parenthood had required suppressing combat identity that military service had developed, Sterling twins understood that partnership they were proposing asked him to resurrect precisely what he'd been deliberately burying, and that successful collaboration would require accommodating his trauma rather than just exploiting his expertise. Over following 6 weeks, Unlikely Alliance strengthened as Isaiah designed combat curriculum, while twins handled business development and marketing, their collaboration revealing that his teaching approach differed fundamentally from sport martial arts' emphasis on belt progression and tournament competition. His curriculum focused on threat assessment, de-escalation, and efficient violence when de-escalation failed, creating a program that acknowledged real self-defense often meant avoiding fights rather than winning them, and that effective combat training prepared students for asymmetric violence rather than for symmetric tournament matches. "Your curriculum is completely different from traditional martial arts," Madison observed during review of Isaiah's proposed program structure. "You're teaching students to run away, to use verbal de-escalation, to accept losing wallet rather than fighting over it. Sport karate teaches that fighting is solution. You're teaching that fighting is last resort after everything else fails. Because real violence has consequences that tournament matches don't," Isaiah explained, articulating philosophy that military combat had taught. "Every fight risks injury, legal liability or death for you or for opponent. Sport martial arts train students to seek competitive challenges, but self-defense means recognizing that real fights aren't competitions with rules and referees. Effective combat training teaches when not to fight more than it teaches how to fight, because avoiding violence is usually smarter than engaging in it." The philosophical difference represented fundamental challenge to martial arts industry model, where belt progression and competition success drove revenue through testing fees and tournament participation. But Isaiah's approach resonated with potential students who'd seen viral video and recognized that sport karate hadn't prepared Sterling twins for real confrontation with combat-trained opponent. "We're getting backlash from traditional martial arts community," Alexis reported 3 weeks into marketing campaign. "Other dojo owners are saying we're abandoning martial arts values by bringing in military instructor who teaches street fighting instead of discipline and respect. They're claiming your curriculum undermines legitimate martial arts by prioritizing violence over traditional training. Tell them that combat effectiveness and traditional values aren't mutually exclusive," Isaiah replied calmly. "I teach respect by emphasizing de-escalation and threat avoidance. I teach discipline through rigorous physical training that combat readiness requires. And I teach violence as last resort rather than first response, which seems more ethical than sport martial arts that train students to seek competitive fights, where simulated violence is entertainment rather than necessity. Some alliances require bridging sport martial arts and combat training by acknowledging the tournament success and self-defense capability measure different skills, and that effective collaboration sometimes means challenging industry assumptions about correlation between belt rank and fighting ability, when viral video has already proven that traditional hierarchy doesn't reflect combat reality. The confrontation that would determine whether Isaiah's combat training program could coexist with traditional martial arts reached its climax when International Karate Federation filed formal complaint with State Athletic Commission, alleging that Sterling Martial Arts Center was operating unlicensed combat sports instruction through Isaiah's program, claiming that his military-based curriculum constituted professional fighting instruction that required specialized certification, which former Marine didn't possess because combat experience didn't translate to civilian teaching credentials under regulations designed to protect students from unqualified instructors. The complaint argues that your military training doesn't qualify you to teach civilians because Marine Corps certification isn't recognized by State Athletic Commission, Alexis explained during emergency meeting where twins and Isaiah processed legal threat that could shut down combat program before it fully launched. "They're saying that teaching hand-to-hand combat requires civilian instructor certification from recognized martial arts organization, and that your 15 years as military instructor doesn't count because military training standards differ from civilian safety requirements." At 38, Isaiah possessed frustrated recognition that bureaucratic credentialing often valued paperwork over actual expertise, creating systems where his 15 years training elite military operators was legally insufficient for teaching self-defense to civilians because proper forms hadn't been filed with appropriate regulatory bodies whose authority over violence instruction he'd been ignoring, through assumption that competence mattered more than certification. So International Karate Federation, organization that certified Sterling twins, whose black belts I dominated in 17 seconds, is arguing that I'm unqualified to teach combat, Isaiah asked, recognizing absurdity of sport karate organization questioning combat instructors' credentials after viral video had demonstrated exactly which training methodology produced superior fighting capability. "They're arguing that credential recognition matters regardless of demonstrated capability," Madison clarified, presenting legal theory that prioritized institutional authority over empirical evidence. State Athletic Commission regulates combat sports instruction to protect students from injury caused by unqualified teachers, and their regulations require civilian teaching certification that you don't have because you obtained expertise through military service rather than through approved civilian pathway. This is political retaliation from traditional martial arts community that resents our program, threatening their business model, Alexis added, contextualizing complaint within broader industry conflict. 43 traditional dojos have lost members to our combat program in 6 weeks since launch. An International Karate Federation represents those dojos' interests. They're using regulatory complaint to eliminate competitive threat rather than to protect student safety. Now, as legal battle intensified with State Athletic Commission's scheduling hearing about Isaiah's teaching credentials, while International Karate Federation prepared arguments that military combat training was fundamentally incompatible with civilian instruction standards, all participants understood that confrontation transcended individual case to represent broader question about whether combat effectiveness or institutional credentialing determine teaching qualification when those competing. Measures of expertise produced contradictory conclusions. Meanwhile, media attention that viral video had created reached new intensity when ESPN produced feature segment about Janitor who exposed martial arts industry's credibility crisis, interviewing Isaiah about military background while questioning whether traditional belt systems measured actual fighting ability or just provided revenue through testing fees that advancing ranks required. The martial arts industry has billion-dollar economy built on belt progression and tournament competition. ESPN reporter Catherine Morgan said during interview that Isaiah had reluctantly accepted. Your 17-second domination of 2 third-degree black belts suggests that belt ranks don't correlate with combat effectiveness. Do you think traditional martial arts are scamming students by selling credentials that don't produce fighting capability? I think sport martial arts and combat training measure different skills that serve different purposes, Isaiah replied carefully, avoiding inflammatory characterization that media wanted. Tournament karate develops discipline, physical fitness, and competitive spirit. Those are valuable outcomes that justify traditional training. But self-defense requires different skill set, focused on threat assessment and efficient violence, that sport training doesn't emphasize because tournament rules forbid techniques that real fights require. Both approaches have merit. Problem emerges when sport martial arts market themselves as self-defense training without acknowledging limitations of competition-focused curriculum. The nuanced response frustrated reporter seeking simple narrative about traditional martial arts being exposed as fraud. But Isaiah's refusal to completely dismiss sport training revealed respect for different methodologies, even while acknowledging that his combat expertise represented separate category that belt systems inadequately measured. As ESPN segment aired with 7 million viewers and social media erupted with renewed debate about martial arts credibility, State Athletic Commission hearing approached, where Isaiah would defend his teaching qualifications against International Karate Federation's argument that military expertise couldn't substitute for civilian certification regardless of demonstrated capability. Mr. Mitchell, you're asking this commission to recognize 15 years of Marine Corps instruction as equivalent to civilian teaching certification, Athletic Commission Chairman Robert Foster said during hearing. But military training serves different purpose than civilian self-defense. Marines prepare for lethal combat in war zones where different rules apply than what's appropriate for civilian students seeking personal safety skills. How do you justify teaching military techniques to civilians who aren't preparing for battlefield conditions? Chairman Foster, civilian self-defense situations often involve asymmetric violence where attackers don't follow rules and where survival requires techniques that sport martial arts forbid, Isaiah replied, challenging distinction between military and civilian violence that Commission's question assumed. Teaching civilians to defend themselves effectively means providing realistic training that acknowledges attackers won't follow tournament rules, which requires instruction in techniques that military combat developed, but which traditional martial arts often dismiss as too aggressive, despite being most effective responses to actual violence. But Mr. Mitchell, your training methods include techniques that could cause serious injury if applied improperly, Foster continued, reading from International Karate Federation's complaint. Chokes, joint locks, strikes to vulnerable targets. These aren't appropriate for civilian instruction without proper safety protocols that civilian certification ensures through standardized training that military instruction doesn't provide. Chairman Foster, I rendered Madison Sterling unconscious in 4 seconds using properly applied carotid choke that caused zero lasting injury because military training emphasizes control and precision, Isaiah countered. Sport martial arts that your commission certifies include strikes to head that cause cumulative brain trauma through repeated competition. Yet those techniques are approved while controlled submissions that cause temporary unconsciousness are questioned. That inconsistency suggests this hearing prioritizes institutional authority over actual safety evaluation. The exchange revealed fundamental tension. Athletic Commission defended civilian certification requirements that protected institutional control over violence instruction, while Isaiah argued that demonstrated expertise should matter more than paperwork, when evidence showed his techniques were safer and more effective than approved sport martial arts that regulatory framework protected. As hearing continued with testimony from martial arts experts supporting both sides, Sterling twins made strategic decision that would either save Isaiah's program or permanently damage their business relationship with traditional martial arts community that International Karate Federation represented. Chairman Foster, I'm Alexis Sterling, and I hold 3rd-degree black belt from International Karate Federation. Alexis testified during hearing's afternoon session. I'm here to state that Isaiah Mitchell's combat instruction is superior to traditional karate training I received through IKF-certified pathway, and that questioning his qualifications while certifying sport martial arts that viral video proved ineffective represents institutional protection of inferior methodology over evidence-based evaluation of teaching effectiveness. The testimony was both brave and professionally costly. Alexis was publicly criticizing organization that had certified her credentials while supporting instructor whose program threatened traditional martial arts business model that her gym had previously participated in, creating permanent break with martial arts establishment that her testimony couldn't walk back, regardless of hearing's outcome. Some confrontations with institutional authority require choosing between credential recognition and demonstrated expertise when bureaucratic systems protect inferior methodologies through regulations that prioritize paperwork over evidence, and defending effective instruction sometimes means alienating establishments whose approval matters less than serving students, whose safety depends on realistic training rather than traditional credentials that viral video already proved inadequate for actual combat. 19 months after State Athletic Commission had ruled that Isaiah's military expertise qualified him for civilian instruction certification, following extensive review that his teaching methodology was both safe and effective, he stood at Sterling Martial Arts Center watching Amara, now 10 years old and significantly healthier after better insurance through his instructor salary had provided improved asthma management, demonstrate self-defense techniques to beginner class that combined his combat principles with age-appropriate modifications that taught children threat avoidance and basic escapes without exposure to violence that adult training included. The center had transformed since viral moment that had exposed combat effectiveness gaps in traditional martial arts. Enrollment had tripled. Curriculum now balanced sport karate with realistic self-defense. And Sterling twins had rebuilt their reputation not through denying humiliation, but through embracing it as catalyst for improvement that made their gym model for how traditional martial arts could evolve beyond tournament focus into practical, defensive training. "Your daughter's a natural teacher," Madison observed as they watched Amara explain to 7-year-olds how recognizing unsafe situations mattered more than knowing fighting techniques. "She has your calm authority, but explains concepts in ways kids understand better than when adults teach same material." De sais-tu, at 39, Isaiah possessed integrated identity that characterized people whose trauma had been processed sufficiently that teaching combat no longer triggered PTSD symptoms that had made instruction psychologically dangerous when partnership had first been proposed. 18 months of therapy focused on separating military violence from civilian instruction had created mental framework where teaching self-defense felt like service rather than like resurrection of warrior identity that Michelle's death had required him to bury. "Amara understands what it's like to feel vulnerable because of her asthma," Isaiah replied, explaining why his daughter connected with students whose physical limitations made them feel defenseless. "She teaches from experience of needing strategies that work when your body isn't reliable, which resonates with kids who aren't naturally athletic, but who still deserve effective self-protection." Till the teaching partnership between father and daughter represented healing that neither had anticipated when viral video had first disrupted their quiet life. Amara had processed her father's hidden expertise not as betrayal, but as discovery that Daddy's gentleness was choice rather than limitation. And Isaiah had learned that sharing combat knowledge with daughter created connection rather than corrupting her innocence as he'd feared. Meanwhile, romantic tension that had been developing between Isaiah and Sterling twins over 18 months of professional collaboration had reached point where all three had to acknowledge that partnership had evolved beyond business relationship into something more intimate, that their careful professional boundaries had been inadequately containing. "We need to discuss what's happening between us," Alexis said, during private dinner that had ostensibly been scheduled to review business financials, but which all three recognized was actually about addressing personal feelings that professional context had been preventing them from naming directly. "Isaiah, Madison and I have spent 18 months working with you constantly, and at some point our respect for your expertise became a traction that we've been pretending doesn't exist because acknowledging it complicates business partnership. And because we're twins who've shared everything our entire lives, which makes this situation complicated in ways that normal attraction isn't," Madison added, articulating dynamic that made their interest in Isaiah more complex than typical romantic pursuit. "We're not proposing some weird situation where you have to choose between us. We're trying to figure out if there's version of this where we're honest about feelings while maintaining business relationship and respecting that you're single parent whose daughter's needs come first." At 39, Isaiah possessed emerging openness to relationships that 2 years ago had seemed impossible when grief over Michelle's death had made romantic connection feel like betrayal of memory. But therapy and time had created space where loving again didn't require forgetting first wife. And Sterling twins' patient respect for his boundaries had built trust that made vulnerability seem safe rather than threatening. "I'm attracted to both of you," Isaiah admitted, his honesty about complicated feelings representing progress from man who'd been avoiding all romantic attachment. "Which creates exactly the complexity Madison mentioned, because I don't know how to navigate being involved with twins without situation becoming disaster that destroys business partnership and probably hurts all of us, including Amara, who's attached to both of you as mentors and friends." "What if we don't navigate it?" Alexis proposed, presenting alternative to conventional relationship structure. "What if we acknowledge mutual attraction, spend time together when it feels natural, and let relationship develop organically without forcing it into traditional framework that might not fit our actual dynamic? We're business partners first, and anything romantic has to serve that foundation rather than threatening it. The proposal was both unconventional and oddly practical. Rather than forcing immediate definition of relationship status or choosing between twins, Isaiah could explore connection with both women while prioritizing partnership and Amara's stability that romantic drama would threaten, creating framework where feelings could develop without pressure to conform to traditional relationship escalator that their unusual situation didn't match. Over following months, unconventional arrangement developed where Isaiah spent time with both Sterling twins, individually and collectively, their relationship resisting simple categorization as either friendship or romance, but incorporating elements of both through fluid dynamic that prioritized emotional honesty over social conventions, about exclusive commitment that their complicated feelings didn't fit. People at gym are speculating about whether you're dating Alexis or Madison or both, Amara reported during breakfast one morning with characteristic 10-year-old directness. Sophie asked me yesterday if you have two girlfriends, and I didn't know what to tell her because I don't actually know what's happening either. What's happening is that your dad cares about both Alexis and Madison, and we're figuring out what that means without rushing into labels that might not fit our actual relationship, Isaiah replied, using honest explanation that respected daughter's intelligence. Does that bother you, that I'm spending time with both of them? It's weird, but not bad weird, Amara answered thoughtfully. They're both nice to me. They don't try to replace Mom, even though I never met her, and you seem happier than you've been since I can remember. So if you're happy, and they're happy, and nobody's being mean, then I don't care if it's conventional or not. The acceptance from 10-year-old, who'd been consulted about relationship that affected her life, represented permission that Isaiah had been waiting for. Not because Amara's approval was required, but because her comfort mattered more than adult romantic fulfillment when those competing priorities conflicted. 3 years after viral video of 17-second sparring match had exposed hidden expertise and catalyzed transformation of Sterling Martial Arts Center into model for evolved combat training, Isaiah stood beside both Sterling twins at community event celebrating gym's impact on self-defense education, watching presentation about how their program had trained over 2,000 students in realistic protective skills while maintaining safety record that vindicated Athletic Commission's decision to certify military-based instruction despite traditional martial arts establishments' objections. We're grateful to Isaiah for teaching us humility along with combat effectiveness, Alexis said during speech that acknowledged original viral humiliation rather than trying to minimize it. 3 years ago, we challenged our janitor to spar because we assumed black belts meant we were superior fighters. 17 seconds later, we learned that credentials don't measure capability, that respect should be earned through character rather than assumed through position, and that sometimes the people we overlook possess exactly what we need to become better versions of ourselves. Some families form not through conventional romance or traditional structures, but through unconventional arrangements that prioritize honesty over social expectations, where business partnerships and romantic feelings and parenting responsibilities blend into relationships that resist simple definition, but which serve everyone's needs better than conventional frameworks, that their complicated dynamics don't fit. Proving that love takes many forms when people prioritize mutual care over conforming to relationship templates that assume exclusivity and traditional progression are only paths to meaningful connection. The end. If you felt those 17 seconds when everything changed, if you understood why Isaiah tried to refuse that challenge, if you've ever been underestimated because of your job, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button if this story moved you. Comment below. What time is it? Where are you watching from? Have you ever had hidden skills that people didn't know about? Have you ever been challenged by someone who underestimated you? Would you have accepted that spar if you were Isaiah? Share this with anyone who needs to understand that expertise doesn't always wear expensive clothes, that humility sometimes comes from 17-second lessons, and that families can form in unconventional ways when people prioritize honesty over social expectations. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.